The night enveloped everything in ominous silence. Only rare drops of spring rain fell from the heavens, as if nature itself could not decide whether to bless this union or mourn it in advance. In the stone halls of the ancient castle, illuminated by the flickering light of candles, a young woman in snow-white garments stood before a mirror. The heavy bronze frame reflected not only her silhouette, but also the subtle tremor in her fingers, the hidden fear in her eyes. "You are not trembling, Bona. This is merely the evening chill," she whispered to herself in Italian, pleading with her reflection not to betray her turmoil. But the cause was not the coolness at all. Her heart beat with such force as if a wild beast were trapped in her chest, striving to break free. Everything that had happened during the day seemed as though it should inspire pride and joy. The gleam of the crown, the solemnity of the wedding ceremony, the multitude of noble guests, the abundant feast, the admiring gazes. However, neither jewels nor high title could silence the inner voice that ceaselessly repeated, "Now you are in his power." Her name was Bona Sforza. Daughter of an ancient Milanese family, she had inherited ambitions worthy of Roman emperors and a mind sharp as a blade. She had arrived in Poland not merely as a bride, but as part of a complex political calculation, as a living formula of alliance. In the chests of her retinue, they carried silk, spices, jewelry. But her main treasures were loyal people, connections with Italian bankers, political alliances, and prospects for the mighty Jagiellonian dynasty. The wedding was merely a celebration, but her personal triumph was to be accomplished this night. Only after the wedding bed could she officially be called a true queen, the lawful wife of King Sigismund. And here began that horror which was not written about in diplomatic treatises and was not mentioned at balls. Her husband, Sigismund, ruler of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, lord of lands from the Baltic Sea to the mysterious forests of Volhynia, was a man weary, imperious, almost 30 years her senior. His gaze betrayed the exhaustion of a man who had passed through wars, intrigues, and losses. His first wife, Barbara Zapolya, had died in the agony of childbirth in 1515, taking with her the king's only heir, an infant. "Death took her on the very day I awaited life," he had confessed once, and since then feared to attach himself again, to love, to lose. But how could a king manage without a successor? Without a son? Neither peace nor future. That is precisely why he chose Bona, young, noble, with a clear mind and robust health. An Italian woman in a foreign country, a bride in an ancient castle. Her mission was perfectly clear: to bear an heir, and before that to pass through the ancient ritual by candlelight, under the intent gazes of courtiers, on a bed that this night would become an arena. She knew the slightest misstep, any show of weakness, and they would tear her apart. At court, there were those who thirsted for her failure, who saw in her only a foreigner, a threat. Even if she had wanted to flee, there was no way back. Too much had been staked. "Hold on, Bona," she whispered to herself again, touching the silver medallion at her neck. "Hold on, and one day you will become mistress not only of Poland." Her path was just beginning, and ahead lay a night full of gazes, shadows, wine, and ancient fear. The wedding feast in Wawel Castle hummed like a boiling cauldron. The air was saturated with aromas of roasted game, Eastern spices, sweet almonds, and smoke from hundreds of wax candles. their light reflected in crystal goblets, in mirrors, in gilded cups, in the eyes of courtiers. Music flowed from the second tier of the hall, where musicians in green and gold garments were positioned. Lutes, shawms, harps sounded, creating a sense of unreality, as if everything was happening in a fairy tale. But only for one woman was the fairy tale not such. Bona sat at the head of the table, surrounded by the gleam of jewels, but alone in her thoughts. She wore a dark red velvet dress with silver embroidery, heavy as armor. Behind her rose the crown. On her chest sparkled a sapphire brooch in the shape of the sun. All Poland looked at her, and she responded with a learned, perfect, almost lifeless smile, silently chewing air. "Your Majesty, perhaps some water with lemon?" Leaned over her a young servant with a meek face. Her voice was quiet as the rustle of a draft. Bona barely turned her head. "No, thank you. I am fine," she answered in Polish. The words came easily to her, as if the language had been familiar since childhood. But a light, melodious accent still betrayed her foreignness. She surveyed the guests. Drunken magnates, old men with rings on their fingers, ladies with loose hair, a rare liberty for this evening. All were merry, laughing, exchanging jokes, and at the far door dancing had already begun. Bona counted the beats of her heart, trying to keep her breathing steady. "Not now. Don't tremble. You are of the Sforza lineage. You are Isabella's daughter." Her mother, Isabella of Aragon, knew no mercy. When Bona as a child fell from a horse and crying tried to get up, her mother only said, "A queen does not cry, even if her bones are broken." And Bona rose. Since then, she had never fallen again. Today, she again could not show weakness. Even here, in this hall, full of unfamiliar faces, in this country where she had yet to find her place, she was like a statue, graceful, cold, flawless, but inside, everything burned. Sigismund sat beside her. His cheeks had reddened from wine, his eyes slightly clouded. The king held himself straight, but from time to time his head nodded forward, and he began to mutter something under his breath. One of his confidants, Prince Frederick, had already thrice nudged him under the elbow, reminding him that the official evening continued. "The young queen is beautiful as a morning flower," loudly proclaimed one of the Lithuanian nobles, raising his cup. "May this night give us a future king." The hall exploded in applause. Someone drummed palms on the table. Someone whistled. Bona lowered her eyes, feeling how inside everything compressed, as from a sword blow. Must she really rejoice when her soul was tearing apart? "They all look at me like a mare being led to the stallion's stall." A servant bent down and whispered something in the chamberlain's ear. He nodded, stepped forward, and loudly announced, "The hour has come. The sovereign and sovereign retire to the bridal chambers." The hall roared with approval. Music sounded again. Wine flowed anew. People rose, raised toasts, shouted wishes. Bona stood slowly, precisely, straight, as she had been taught. Her eyes were dry. Servants hastened after her, carrying boxes with linens, a shift, combs, aromatic oils. Someone jokingly offered her a cup of wine for luck, but she refused. No, Sforza did not want to enter this trial in a state of intoxication. In one of the narrow, dark corridors, a servant threw a woolen shawl over her shoulders. "Are you trembling, signora?" "No, this is just the evening chill," Bona whispered again, looking somewhere beyond the horizon, into the future that was beginning now. In a white shift, under the gazes of witnesses, on foreign soil. King Sigismund rose heavily from the throne, leaning on a gilded staff with a ruby head. His movements were unhurried, like those of a man long accustomed to pain in his joints. Alcohol had laid a crimson mask on his face, but his voice still sounded commanding. "It is time, gentlemen," he said with a slight smile, as if inviting not to a wedding night, but to another diplomatic game. Bona stood, straightening her back like an arrow. Her silk cloak, purple as blood on snow, rustled behind her. Two ladies-in-waiting supported the train, stepping on the stone tiles of the corridor. Torches along the walls cast sinister shadows on her face, and it seemed as if Wawel was breathing down her neck. The castle came alive. It knew where she was going. If only not to tremble, thought Bona, feeling how each step became heavier. The staircase led upward, to the king's bedchamber. But this room was not a place of love, not a corner of solitude. This was a stage, a theater of flesh. The doors flew open. Bona froze on the threshold. The room was flooded with light. Dozens of candles in candelabra, wall sconces, chandeliers. Light played on the golden fabrics covering the walls and on the gleam of weapons hanging at the head. In the center rose a huge bed with a canopy, under which a feast for 5 could comfortably be held. Pillows, down mattresses, embroidered coverlets. All this resembled not a bed, but a throne of flesh. But the most horrible thing was different. Following them into the chambers came guests. There were no fewer than 20 of them. Courtiers, counts, magnates, ambassadors, princes, a bishop in a crimson mantle, and even an elderly representative of the Roman Empire with a nose sharp as a falcon's beak. Each held a cup in his hands, and almost each, half empty. Some exchanged meaningful glances, as if expecting fireworks. Servants, as if nothing was happening, began to arrange chairs and armchairs around the bed, as if preparing for a performance in the Theatre dell'Arte. On silver dishes lay marzipan in the shape of hearts, figs, dried roses, spiced almond cookies. Wine again flowed like a river. Bona swallowed. She felt tremor rising from her legs to her shoulders, how her skin became icy. "Are you serious?" she whispered in Italian. Her voice was quieter than the rustle of silk. None of the guests, of course, understood the words, but perhaps caught the shade of horror in them. "This is madness. This is disgrace. Are they really going to watch?" This was a barbaric, ancient tradition, absurd, like everything concerning marriage unions between monarchs. The act of consummation had to be witnessed. Marriage was not a manifestation of love. It was an alliance, a contract, a guarantee of succession. And how to verify an alliance without witnesses? "Such is the custom," said the old servant, fastening on Bona a long white shift of fine linen. "It has always been so. Queen Jadwiga herself went through this." Bona said nothing in reply. She stared at the point where the ceiling met the wall, trying not to breathe. If they had cut her open now, inside there would be no blood, only ice. Finally, she sat on the edge of the bed, slowly, like a statue brought to motion by someone's will. The white shift almost glowed in the twilight. Behind her, the ladies-in-waiting froze like shadows. On the other side of the bed settled Sigismund. He could barely keep on his feet. His cheeks blazed. His eyes were half closed. He leaned toward her and croaked, almost inaudibly, "Don't be afraid. This is just one evening." "One evening for a crown." Bona nodded for the first time all evening, sincerely and without posturing, because he was right. One evening to endure, and then she would be queen. Full, lawful, unshakable. Silence fell. Someone coughed. A servant with a tray froze by the wall. And suddenly, as if by signal, the assembled guests, elders, diplomatic representatives, influential patrons, rose one after another. Nodding, they left the chambers. Everything happened quietly, almost solemnly. The door closed behind them. Finally, silence came. Finally, they were alone. But Bona already sensed, even in this ringing emptiness, the coming night promised to be stormy. Extremely stormy. Sigismund, having removed his crown, already sat on the edge of the bed. He had rid himself of his mantle, cast off his doublet, remaining only in a thin shirt that hung noticeably loose on his shoulders. Purple stains from wine were still visible on the collar, and at his feet lay a belt with a silver buckle, decorated with the coat of arms of Poland. His face, still glowing with heat after the Epirus wine, now resembled a mask stripped of former grandeur. Bona looked at him and did not recognize him. Before her sat not a monarch who determined the fates of peoples, not a ruler who gave her his hand for a dynastic alliance. No. Before her sat an exhausted man, lonely, embarrassed, somewhat pitiful, and, terrible to admit, timid. In his eyes was the same uncertainty as in her own, perhaps even fear. He ran his hand across his forehead, exhaled noisily, paused, and then, as if remembering the need to show tenderness, whispered, "Don't be afraid." The words sounded soft, unexpected, but there was no warmth in them addressed to her. This was not care, but rather an attempt to justify, to apologize. Probably he feared not so much the woman as the moment itself. Obligations, age, and unknown future. Bona nodded without raising her eyes. "I don't fear you, Sigismund. I fear that after this night, I will become merely someone's idea, a queen on a coat of arms, a puppet, a symbol, but not a woman." An oppressive silence hung in the room. Not a sound, not a sigh. Outside the window howled a storm foreboding wind, and torches in the corridor cast trembling shadows under the door, and inside, only the two of them. Sigismund leaned back against the headboard, closing his eyes. From his face disappeared even the shadow of pretense, any attempt to play the role of king. He was without crown, without power, without words. How much time passed? Bona did not know. Perhaps a minute? Or perhaps an entire eternity? She did not remember how that night passed. Only one sensation remained with her, as if they had stripped the skin from her, leaving her standing naked under foreign gazes, even when the room was already empty. Many years later, in her declining years, that evening would become for her the embodiment of everything she would have to endure. Doubts, betrayals, intrigues. She would learn to be strong. But then, on that first wedding night, she simply froze. And in the morning, a legend was born. They said that the king, with a disappointed expression and a wrinkled shirt, came out into the corridor without saying a word, threw his cup against the wall and hissed, "The queen brought me 3 gifts, a painted face, false coins, and too spacious a bed." So it was recorded in one of the German chronicles. Historians still argue whether he actually spoke these words. Some believe that these lines were composed by Bona's enemies, perhaps someone from the Habsburg circle. Others consider it merely a malicious tale, so beloved in those centuries, to cast a shadow on too clever a woman. Bona did not justify herself. She preferred to remain silent, knowing that deeds would follow words, and her time would yet come. Morning glory. Morning came not with reproaches, but with gold. With the first rays of sun over Wawel Castle, when dew had not yet dried on the stained glass windows, servants entered the royal bedchamber, quietly, almost with reverence. In their hands they carried trays decorated with precious rings, pearl necklaces, parchments with seals promising lands, revenues, and grants. All this was a morning gift, a royal gesture of recognition of his wife, a sign that she had become a true spouse, lawful, influential. Bona sat at the mirror. Her loose hair fell in soft waves on her shoulders. On her lips played a restrained smile. She did not ask why these gifts were brought. She knew. Behind her footsteps were heard, unhurried, weighty. The king entered without mantle, without crown, in simple home clothes. His voice, slightly hoarse after sleep, sounded almost warm. "Good morning, my queen." He stopped behind and for some time simply looked at her reflection in the mirror. Perhaps for the first time he truly looked at her, not as a trophy, not as the result of a dynastic agreement, not as a young body capable of bearing an heir, but as a woman behind whose eyes an entire world was hidden. At this moment, he realized, under the tender skin of this Italian woman lurked something greater. She was not merely an ornament of the throne, not a puppet, not a man's shadow. In this woman was a mind sharp as a blade, a gaze full of determination, cold, rational grace. She was born not only to wear a crown, but to rule with it. And Bona did not disappoint. In the following years, she bore 5 children, 3 daughters, 2 of whom became queens, Isabella in Hungary and Sophia in Bavaria, and, of course, a son, Sigismund Augustus, Bona's favorite. It was him, bypassing the ancient Polish tradition of choosing a king by the nobility, that she proclaimed co-ruler while her husband still lived. Poland had never known such a thing, and the Polish nobility, especially those accustomed to considering themselves above kings, trembled, because behind the youth's back stood she, Bona, merciless to traitors. Quick in decisions, silent in retribution. Having become a dowager queen, she did not disappear into shadow like others. On the contrary, her influence only grew. She became a political player of European scale, the richest woman of the continent, owner of lands, manufactories, seaports, vineyards. Even the Habsburgs, the crowned masters of Palmyra, turned to her for loans. To the north of the Polish kingdom came Italian fashion, new vegetables, new customs, even new turns of speech. In the south, roads were built, taxes reformed, estates expanded. Inside, castles appeared ceramics, books, new ideas. Poland began to breathe differently, to build, develop, change. All this was her work, her dream, her power. But Bona's fame was two-faced. In the eyes of some, she was a reformer, a visionary, a ruler who was ahead of her time. In the eyes of others, a serpent, a poisoner, a woman too clever for her sex, too foreign for her country. No one forgives a woman for strength, especially when she does not bow her head. And yet, in that morning light, when the gold of the morning gift cast reflections on the walls of Wawel Castle, began the story not simply of a queen, but of a legend. Milanese blood in Krakow walls. She entered Poland not as a guest, but as change. The silks, oil, saplings of exotic trees, and books in Latin packed in chests were merely the shell. The real cargo with which Bona Sforza arrived in Krakow. This was mind, ambitions, and determination to change the world into which politics had thrust her. With her came Renaissance Italy, alive, fragrant with spices, full of geometric clarity of thought and form. At court feasts, besides traditional sausages and dumplings, suddenly appeared olives, figs, artichokes, pasta with herb sauce, which was initially called herbal gruel. Servants warily sniffed oranges, as if it were medicine or poison. Winter gardens at castles filled with lemon and orange trees in tubs. They were carefully wrapped in frosts like infants. Dresses became narrower, hats wider. In libraries appeared more books, on walls, more light. Even the smells in Wawel's corridors changed. Instead of resin and meat, incense, lavender, and olive oil. But the brighter her trail shone, the thicker became the shadows behind her back. Polish nobility saw in her a foreigner, the people, an Italian woman with a cunning smile, a woman speaking with an accent and not hiding her intelligence. In a country where submission was expected from women, she made decisions, proposed, commanded. Where men whispered, she spoke aloud. Where other queens remained silent behind screens, Bona sat over maps of lands, drew plans of roads, corresponded with the Roman Pope and Milanese bankers. Men feared, women envied. Witch, was whispered behind her back. Poisoner, added those who themselves later dreamed of treating enemies with sweet wine laced with poison. Rumors intensified, especially after her husband's death. The Dowager Queen remained without crown, but not without power. She was not exiled. She remained in the castle like a shadow of the past century, in dresses with black ribbons, but lost her main protection. Old Sigismund was not ideal, not in love, but he restrained the assault of ill-wishers. Now without him she became a target, vulnerable though still defiant. In late portraits, Bona is depicted with thin, faded lips, in black with eyes tired of looking forward. The smile disappeared, as if cut out by the artist's brush. The blush vanished, giving way to waxy pallor. Now artists painted not a queen, but memory, not power, but experienced pain. But even in this image, strength was felt, for her blood was Milanese, and Milan, a city of intrigues, iron, and arts, and no Krakow walls could strangle in her that essence which had been there from birth. A woman created not for submission, but for history. Beauty in exile. In exile behind the stone walls of Bari Castle, where time flowed differently, slowly, viscously like olive oil, her mirror was silent. It no longer flattered, no longer reflected the one who had once been admired. But in the memory of many, especially men who had at least once looked at her with wonder, lived a completely different Bona. Hair the color of honey, slightly curling like wheat in the Tuscan wind. Eyebrows like arcs, precise as if drawn with compass. Eyelashes dark as raven's wing, and so thick that when she blinked, it seemed shadow fell. Eyes of heavenly light, not blue but angelic, without time and age. Lips coral, as if Aphrodite herself had kissed them. Teeth white as snow on alpine peaks at dawn. Neck straight, graceful, like a swan's. Hands delicate. with skin so tender it seemed like jasmine petals. Such she was seen at court, in Italy, in Krakow, in Rome. Such young artists drew her, in love with the idea of woman muse. Such men fell in love with, wrote poems to, swore oaths to, looked at secretly. But all this was then, before power, before intrigues, before bitterness, before the world saw in her not only a woman, but also strength. In Bari, her beauty remained in letters, in memories, in portraits, gathering dust in galleries. She no longer needed it because now, looking in the mirror, she saw not skin and lips, but the road she had traveled. And only the closest knew, even then, in old age, in exile, by candlelight, when shadows played on her face. Sometimes in her suddenly appeared that very Bona. From her very youth, as if from an ancient fairy tale, from the depths of legends. The one whose incomparable beauty was not merely a natural gift, but also a fearsome weapon, a shining crown, and simultaneously, a heavy curse. The last cup brought in silence. Autumn was approaching over her domain, painted in copper and serene tones. Olive groves dropped their foliage, and the gentle sea wind whispered ancient, forgotten prayers. The castle where Queen Bona Sforza spent her last years rose like a marble mausoleum, majestic, solitary, with mighty walls in which, it seemed, echoes of former power were forever frozen. The crown itself had long left her head, but her influential voice still sounded in letters, in cunning treaties, in immutable orders. Even in exile, far from native Poland, she remained a true queen, foreign, rejected, but not broken. Her ill-wishers nourished hope that the passage of time and distance would erase her influence from the memory of peoples. But they were cruelly mistaken. Until her very last hour, Bona continued to conduct political games, maintained correspondence with Rome, carefully controlled finances, and wove new designs. She still held in her hands the thin threads of control, though she felt how her fingers were losing their former grip, and once faithful friends were becoming suspiciously silent. A servant hidden in shadow. This servant was an enigma to all. It was rumored that he had appeared quite recently, presented supposedly with impeccable recommendations from a very reliable source. They said he was handsome, courteous, and irreproachable in his manners. That night, he served her a cup of wine, as he had done more than once before. But this time in his gaze was a strange emptiness, as if he was bidding farewell in advance. The wine exuded the aroma of spices. Bona brought the cup to her lips, took only one tiny sip. A few hours later, she was seized by agonizing illness. She understood, knowing too well the treachery of poisons, having heard too often whispers about perfidious poisoners, not to recognize the symptoms. "So this is how," she whispered, lying in her bed. Not from war, not from a blade, but from a cup, like Caesar once, but not from Brutus. Her eyes remained dry. Pain tore her apart from within, but she made not a sound, only squeezed in her fingers the family ring with the Sforza coat of arms. A small shield she had worn since childhood as an eternal reminder, you are not merely a woman, you are a dynasty. Legend sealed in a will. The servant disappeared that same night. No one ever saw him again. Later they whispered that he was an agent of Spanish King Philip II, to whom Bona had never forgiven debts and seized lands. Others were certain that the Habsburgs were behind it all, or perhaps someone among the Polish magnates, harboring malice for years of humiliation and injustices. Or maybe it was all simply a matter of time? A queen who had played against established rules too long could not leave peacefully, but she left an indelible mark. In her will were preserved not only lands, titles, and riches. There was her will, her message. The world is ruled not by blade, but by memory, for only it makes death meaningless. Thus departed Bona of the Sforza family. Not merely a woman, but an entire epoch. One of the few who ascended the throne not only by right of blood, but thanks to her sharp mind and indomitable will. And in the tavern by the very water, when the sun was setting, someone swore they saw how the last cup slowly dissolved in the air. A woman who became legend, living embodiment of an entire epoch. Her name was pronounced with many shades, with trembling, with admiration, with muffled hatred. Some called her poisonous Italian, foreigner, sorceress, destroyer of Polish foundations. Others revered her as savior of the royal treasury, mother of the future monarch, enlightened reformer who could not be forgotten. And in each of these opinions was a grain of truth. Bona Sforza was a true child of her time, but perhaps precisely in this lay her paradox. Time itself could not keep up with her. In a world where women's voices most often remained unheard, she spoke. In an epoch where men's game ruled, she kept accounts and was counted equal with them. When kings unleashed wars for territories, she painstakingly gathered them piece by piece through marriage alliances, profitable credits, and wise laws. She was a queen with fire in her eyes and ice in her heart. Mother of a king, co-ruler without formal coronation, owner of lands whose riches could be loaned even to the mighty Habsburgs. A politician in skirts, a strategist with a cold, analytical mind which no Senate could ignore. She conducted correspondence in Latin, spoke Italian, German, Polish. She even understood Russian, for diplomacy knew no boundaries. An Italian woman who conquered Poland without a single sword. She never stepped on a battlefield, but was feared like an experienced commander. She did not don armor, but each of her steps was a calculated tactical move. Poland tasted olive oil and sweet oranges because Bona desired it. Monastic holdings, lands, city privileges, everything passed through her vigilant pen. Even royal elections, seeming immutable, bowed before her undeniable will. She achieved that her son ascended the throne while his father still lived. No one before her had accomplished such a thing. But it all began not in a courtroom, not in an office piled with maps and inkwells, and not in a negotiation room, but in a bedroom. On that very first night, when only a polite smile played on her face and steel gleamed in her eyes, when the room was filled with observers and each of her movements attracted foreign attention. On that night when her bed was full of guests and a young girl from Milan, trembling under a white shift, became not merely a king's wife, but herself, having become an epoch.